Welcome. So today I'm here again with Jonathan Alter. He's the author of four books on the presidency. His most recent is his very best, Jimmy Carter, which is a biography, a full comprehensive biography. This is our second interview, so the link in the comments, link down in the description below, will have our first interview. He also wrote The Promise and The Center Holds about Obama, and The Defining Moment with FDR. So, Jonathan, thanks a lot for coming back on.
My pleasure, Tim.
So, I wanted to start off just going into how you got started in history and studying the presidents, studying leadership. And so you went to Harvard, you studied history at Harvard, and you graduated with honors. And one of the things that stands out about you is just your very broad understanding of history. And I was wondering, like, how did you get into history when you were younger? And how did it go from that to covering presidential campaigns and the presidency, and eventually writing these books?
So when I was a really little kid, like in kindergarten, I guess I was just interested in presidents. I mean, I knew that when I was not yet 3 years old, my parents left us in Chicago, where I was born and raised, and they went to Los Angeles for the 1960 Democratic Convention that nominated John F. Kennedy
Hmm.
president. And I guess the earliest memory I have in life is when they went to that convention and left us with a babysitter. And not all that long after that, like when I was about 4 years old, um, I I memorized the presidents in order with a song that I sang, saying the presidents. And my parents would sort of trot me out as a, party trick, when their friends were there and I come out in my feet pajamas and I recite the presidents. And then my father uh, described me as the only American historian who did not yet know how to read, because where other kids like dinosaurs, I like presidents, especially Lincoln. And there's a picture of me when I'm about 3 years old holding the hand of a mannequin of Abraham Lincoln in Springfield, where we went, to tour his tomb and the house he lived in Springfield, Illinois. And I stayed interested in the presidents throughout grade school and into high school. Although I also got into sports, and when I was in third grade, uh, my mother thought that I was uh, losing losing some of my interest in history. And she marched into the teacher's office. And my mother was a very formidable, assertive woman who, in the years after that, became the first woman ever elected to public office in Cook County, which is the Chicago area.
Mhm.
In 1972, she was elected commissioner of the Metropolitan Sanitary District. It's now called the Water Reclamation District, and they take care of all the sewage in Chicago. She later ran for lieutenant governor of Illinois. She was very,
Wow.
very active in politics and very assertive. So she marches into the third grade teacher's office and she says, "My son could have been Henry Steele Commager, who's a famous Amherst College history professor. My son could have been Henry Steele Commager, and you're turning him into just another little boy who likes sports." That was my mom. And she raised me to be the first Jewish president. My father put less pressure on me.
Wow.
Uh, and so that was her plan, that I would become the first Jewish president. But at that time, Tim, I also was developing a real interest in journalism, and I was publishing a little newspaper that my father would have Xeroxed at his office, and I would distribute to the neighbors, and it was full of neighborhood news, although mostly news about me,
Hmm.
like John lost six baseballs in the bushes in one summer was, one headline.
Hmm.
And so I had these two interests in history and journalism. And when I got to college, I became a history major at Harvard, and I was a reporter and editor on the college newspaper, the Harvard Crimson, which is celebrating its 150th anniversary.
Hmm.
And and then by that time, I was more interested in writing about politics than in being a politician.
Why is that?
Um, I don't know. I guess I always had it in the back of my mind that maybe I would do it myself. But um, I just like that detachment a little bit
Hmm.
from the process, and I wasn't I was a little bit put off by student politicians, the ones who would um, always be on trying to achieve class president or whatever.
Kind of shallow.
Well, I didn't think it was shallow because I've always liked politicians. It wasn't something that I was comfortable in doing, like vote for me.
Hmm.
And so, and I guess just developed that sense of detachment that you need as a journalist or a historian. And I kind of thought I could have gone in the other direction if I had gone to law school, which my mother, again, my father was less pushing me less, kind of wanted me to do, because that's the normal preparation for politics.
Hmm.
And that's, every Jewish mother wants their son to be a lawyer, doctor. And I meant to go to law school, but just kind of forgot about it, slipped my mind. So it never happened. And I did other things. I went into journalism instead.
What did you write a thesis or anything at
I
Harvard?
did. Yeah. I wrote a thesis, and it was really the only, well, one of two experiences that I really, to use a cliche, leaned into at Harvard. The first was that as a freshman, I took a class from a famous Harvard history professor named David Donald. It's about the Civil War and Reconstruction,
Hmm.
and I loved that class and aced that class, and then also did well in some other American history classes, but I did not do well in other uh, subjects that I was less interested in. I kind of phoned it
Hmm.
in other classes, and but I really like David Donald and Bernard Balin, another famous historian of the colonial period. And
Yeah.
then when I was a senior, I wrote my thesis on the war in Vietnam because I was an American history major with a minor within the history department of East Asian studies. So I wrote about U.S. policy making in Vietnam in 1963 and 64 and how we went from a minor commitment to a full military commitment in Vietnam, and that I connected it to what happened in the aftermath of the assassination of President Diem of South Vietnam in 1963, shortly before the Kennedy assassination. And Kennedy basically greenlit a coup against Diem, but he was horrified when it ended up in Diem's death. And if you listen to these Kennedy tapes, he's not long before his own death, he's horrified. The tapes weren't out at that point, but I interviewed Averell Harriman, who had been the great, World War II diplomat ambassador to the Soviet Union. And when I interviewed him in 1979, he was very old, but he had been an important policymaker in the Kennedy White House. And I interviewed Lou Conine, who was the then retired CIA agent who had helped um, to engineer the coup against Diem, and a
Wow.
number of other people. And so that thesis was a kind of a merger of some journalism and writing history. And I received a summa cum laude on the
Wow.
thesis, the highest honors on the thesis. But my grades were so bad in my non-history courses that was called, they had a word for it, cascading. I cascaded from summa right past magna cum laude down to cum laude, which is how I graduated, which is, perfectly respectable. But I had, if I had been a better student and a more diligent student, maybe I could have, you know, graduated with
How
higher.
did you get into Harvard in the first place?
There's an
Was there anything about
interesting
that?
story. I know,
Yeah.
very interesting story. Nowadays, I would never have gotten into any Ivy League school. I would have no chance
Yeah.
because my grades in high school just weren't good enough, especially in math and science. And um, but what happened was I went to a boarding school called Andover, a well-known boarding school, for my last 2 years of high school, where I got great training in history, by the way, from fantastic teachers. And um, I uh, was on the Andover paper. Andover, by the way, is where both President Bush, H.W. and W. Bush, both went to the Corps Academy, Andover.
Mhm.
So I'm on the newspaper, and Jimmy Hoffa, who is was the labor leader who built the Teamsters, had this famous confrontation with Bobby Kennedy in the 1950s. Um, he had by that time he had gone to jail, and when he was in jail, he was there with a white collar criminal whose kids went to Andover. Maybe he went to Andover himself. I don't remember.
Mhm.
And so when Hoffa got out of jail and was on a speaking tour, um, talking about prison reform, um, he came to Andover and he gave a speech. And I was an editor on the high school paper, and I interviewed him,
Mhm.
which was a big deal for me when I was 17 years old. And I asked him some hard questions in the interview, and he had these two thugs around him. He was totally corrupt. And he turns to one of them and he says, "Where'd they get this kid?" And, and my interview comes out, and it's published in the paper. And when I applied to colleges and I got into several Ivy League schools,
Mhm.
I submitted some of my clippings with my application, including the Jimmy Hoffa
Mhm.
interview. And in the interim, Jimmy Hoffa famously disappeared, and his body hasn't been found to this day. And so, right when he is disappearing, they're looking at my application. And they go, "This kid, he may have done the last interview with Jimmy Hoffa.
Yeah.
We got to let him in." And that's how I think I got into college,
Wow.
because even then my grades weren't good enough really to get me in, but I got in everywhere because of thanks to Jimmy Hoffa.
So, I
Sorry, I
mean,
told that story a little long, but it's
No, it's good. It's good.
It's one of
I
my
mean,
favorites.
you're one of the other things about your column at Newsweek is you were kind of uh, foreshadowing um, the blogosphere and kind of commenting on media. So, can you kind of fill the gap from Harvard to Newsweek?
Yeah, it's actually a pretty short gap. So um, when I was still at Harvard, I got to know a guy named Nicholas Lemon, who currently writes for the New Yorker. He's a former dean of the Columbia Journalism School. And when I was a freshman, he was the top editor on the Harvard Crimson. And after he graduated, he went to work at a tiny magazine called the Washington Monthly,
Hmm.
which to this day remains an excellent liberal magazine, moderate liberal magazine. Really good. I really recommend it to everybody.
Can you say it again?
The
Washington
Washington Monthly.
Monthly. Yeah.
And it had included, well, among the people you might have heard of who've worked there over the years are the journalist James Fallows, who went on to the Atlantic. He was Jimmy Carter's chief speechwriter when he was still in his 20s. The current editor, Paul Glastris, was a Bill Clinton speechwriter. Michael Kinsley, uh, John Meacham, who had been editor of Newsweek, very well-known American historian. Taylor Branch, the Pulitzer Prize winning author of multi-volume biography of Martin Luther King. Kate Boo, Pulitzer Prize winner, uh, brilliant journalist, and a number of other really outstanding American journalists. We all started at this tiny magazine, and we were all paid almost nothing. At the time I was there, paid $8,400 a year.
Whoa.
And you would go and you would basically work there for no more than 2 years, sometimes just out of college, sometimes a couple of years out of college. In my case, I was 1 year out of college, but I knew about this magazine through this now New Yorker writer, Nick Lemon. And and so when I got out, I wasn't qualified yet to work there. Um, so I started to freelance pieces for a variety of publications, including the New Republic, where I wrote some over the years. And I made money doing that, and also I worked on the Federal Aviation Administration's in-house magazine. I interviewed the first guy who ever hijacked a plane from prison, and I took a job as a lobbyist for a small environmental group trying to save the Indiana Dunes, where I had vacationed in the summer at the bottom of Lake Michigan, and that brought in a little bit of money. And so in the meantime, I was trying to build up my clips. And so I
Mm.
did that for a year. And then when I went to work at the Washington Monthly, which was founded by one of the most original, brilliant thinkers I've ever met, still alive. His name is Charles Peters. And so by then I was able to get uh, enough clips so that Charlie Peters, uh, this brilliant, hugely eccentric editor, hired me in 1981. And um, Charlie had been, before he started the magazine in 1969, he had been director of evaluation for the Peace Corps. And he had hired these journalists to evaluate Peace Corps programs. And then he started a magazine that basically used journalists to evaluate government programs and political ideas. And Charlie was from West Virginia, and he had been John F. Kennedy's campaign manager in the Charleston, West Virginia area. And the West Virginia primary, for those of you who know your history, was what basically set John F. Kennedy on the course to the presidency. He defeated Hubert Humphrey there in 1960 and went on to win the Democratic nomination.
Mhm.
And Charlie's reward, he had gotten to know Kennedy, was he was a very young man, but he got this job at the Peace Corps when it started. And Charlie um, was just the perfect um, magazine editor to train people in political journalism. So this isn't like the old time city editor at a newspaper who's teaching you how to cover cops and courts. He was teaching us how to cover government and politics, and we would do everything from write cover stories to taking out the garbage, because there were only two editors who worked there at a time. And we spent a lot of our time rewriting kind of badly written articles that were submitted by college professors, and then writing our own pieces.
Mhm.
And it was fantastic training. And Charlie was very good friends with Catherine Graham, the late Catherine Graham, who at that time was the only woman CEO of a Fortune 500 company. And she had assumed management of the Washington Post company, which owned Newsweek at the time and for many years after, and many other holdings. She had ascended to that position after her husband, Phil Graham, committed suicide in 1962 or 63. And Charlie and Kay, who was one of the great women of the 20th century, who won a Pulitzer for her memoirs, Personal History, which I highly recommend. Charlie advised Kay on who the new editor of Newsweek should be, and she hired him, a guy named Bill Broyles, who went on to be a very well-known screenwriter. He wrote Apollo 13 and other movies. And she told Charlie told Kay that Bill needed an assistant who could write for Newsweek, but would also tell him what was going on um, in his own magazine. So tell him the truth, because the truth never makes it to the top, or rarely makes it to the top, because powerful people are surrounded by yes men. And Charlie had advised President Carter when Carter called him in for advice. He had dinner with Carter one night in 1979 with Jesse Jackson, and I have this in my Carter book, and um, uh, the a couple of other people, Christopher Lasch, the author of The Culture of Narcissism, and that evening, Charlie advised Carter, who was not doing well as president at that point, that he needed somebody to tell him the truth about what was going on in his government. And Charlie suggested it be Jim Fallows. And That didn't happen. Charlie didn't succeed in that. So he did with Mrs. Graham, as we called her, what he was unable to do with President Carter. And he got a spy basically implanted in this organization. So I was hired, in Catherine Graham's office, and I moved up to New York, and worked for Bill Broyles. And the first week I was 25 years old. I sat in the editor in chief's office, and I decided not to sit in his chair. He was on vacation. I sat on his couch, and all these people came in and said, "Who is this kid? What is he doing here at Newsweek?" And they quickly identified me, rightly, as a spy who would tell the editor what they were up to. And it took me quite a while to get over that reputation, but I worked with many of those people for the next 28 years at Newsweek, and became very close friends with many of them.
One of the things I got from the Carter book is that Carter was the first to install a lot of these inspector generals,
Yes,
and it's kind
yes.
of an inspector general role that you're talking about.
Again, this is why I really like talking to you, Tim, because I've done many interviews now about my Carter book, and you're the first person who noticed this. And this was a very, very significant Carter accomplishment. Is he established these IG offices all over the place. Now, if you remember from the first Trump impeachment, what happened? Who did Alexander Vindman and the other whistleblowers go to? They went to the inspector general, and no inspector general, no Trump impeachment.
Mm-hmm.
And when you think of the literally billions of dollars that inspectors general have saved in the federal government since Carter established those offices, it's a huge accomplishment. Went along with his overhaul of the civil service system, establishment of the FISA courts, which you also might remember from the first Trump impeachment and Trump stories. And so there were many of these things that were done
How do
under
you measure the impact of the inspect? Is it, corruption? Is it wasted money? Is it there's a deterrence of people aren't going to do things because they know somebody's watching?
That is exactly right. It's all three of those. And so sometimes they will identify, along with the what used to be called the General Accounting Office, and it's now called the the GAO, and I think it's now called the Government
Accountability,
Accountability,
Office of Accountability.
the GAO, and they issue reports along with inspectors general on waste, fraud, and abuse. And people think the government, is bad, but it actually performed worse in the 60s and 70s in many ways. And I think you can credit the inspector general of a particular department. I mean, some are better than others. Some didn't do a good job. Others did a fantastic job, but they saved the taxpayers. I'd argue, if you add it all up over the last 45 years, hundreds of billions of dollars.
The flip side of this is, you wrote about this in the promise that Obama had a tough time getting filling some of these positions because of all the disclosure stuff. And I don't know if Trump had that same issue. There are a combination of things, but what do you think about that issue? The flip side of that.
Well, I mean that the disclosure stuff that's not administered by the inspector general of a
Right.
department. But you're right that it's part of the same kind of suite of bills that ethics bills that Carter uh, initiated, the Ethics in Government Act of 1978, and then it was later expanded and strengthened. And you could argue that some of the disclosure um, requirements were too stiff. Some of them were not required by law. For instance, disclosing your tax returns if you're president was a tradition that
Mm-hmm.
everybody from Carter through Obama respected. I mean, Obama, the reason that he had trouble, hiring certain people is because he respected these ethical standards. Trump had contempt for these ethical standards. So not only did he not disclose, you know, his taxes, but he didn't care at all about hiring people, with very checkered pasts, and we could start talking about
Yeah.
individuals, but there were many of them, and and then he didn't really do very much because he controlled Congress uh, for his first 2 years. So Senate confirmation of these some of these jokers wasn't very difficult
Mm-hmm.
because there was no oversight. of the Trump.
Actually, another thing I wanted to ask you is your thoughts. You wrote an article on the Old Goats, your blog, your Substack. Um, what do you think about these court cases and after a president leaves office, them having uh, they don't have immunity anymore? So, what do you think are how do you think about the value of that immunity while they're in office, and the norms that have surrounded that?
Well, I understand where it came from because if you look at the laws that set up what was called the Office of Independent Counsel, and these special counsels that were appointed to investigate presidents from, um, from Carter, eventually, to Trump. Obama was the only president in that whole time where there was never an investigation of it. And I can understand
This is
why,
federal, right? We're just
yeah,
talking federal. Okay.
so I understand why the impulse for this, that, you're going to tie the president down these investigations. And so there's a Justice Department guideline, it's not even a law, that says that you do not prosecute an incumbent president. The remedy is impeachment. But I think that that needs to be reexamined in light of Trump, because, do we really want a situation where a president commits crimes, or as he put it, shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue, and there's nothing you can do about it because except impeachment, because they're president.
Mhm.
And so I understand that you can have runaway prosecutors, but I also think that, especially right now in our politics, we need to do everything we can to bolster democracy, to bolster the idea that no person is above the law. And if you say no person is above the law, that has to mean the president too,
Yeah.
especially after they leave office. So, this idea that, oh, because he might run for president again, he can't be prosecuted locally or federally, that's ridiculous. I mean, every local politician in scores of jurisdictions who is prosecuted for corruption might be running for office again. So you can't use that to protect politicians. That's turning them into a separate, superior class of Americans. And we don't have a king. And we have to always remind ourselves we fought the American Revolution for the idea that no person is above the law. And so I think that even a very busy president can handle, the occasional deposition or whatever is involved.
Do you see any difference between the state level and the federal level?
Well, the state level doesn't operate under the same strictures. So there are, if it had enough evidence, arguably, the New York DA, the Manhattan DA, could have prosecuted Trump when he was in office. But if you think there was a lot of noise about what Alvin Bragg did now, imagine what it would have been like if his predecessor, Cyrus Vance, or another prosecutor had prosecuted him, indicted him, gotten him indicted when he was president. And so I think the bar should be high. It really should be, something really clear and serious. And if it looks like they're, you know, you should try impeachment first because that is mentioned in the Constitution. But I don't think impeachment or the failure to impeach should impede efforts by the criminal justice system to bring a corrupt president to justice. And if you go back and look at Mitch McConnell's speech on the floor of the Senate after Trump was acquitted in the Senate in the second impeachment, and McConnell, who had, I think history will condemn him for this, had decided that he didn't think that Trump should be impeached for the assault on the Capitol. Um, he says this is a matter for the criminal justice system. He basically invites the prosecution of Trump for the events of January 6th. You know, it's a very interesting speech to look at now that all these Republicans are, you know, including McConnell, are saying they'll support him if he's the Republican nominee, which is insane. It's basically saying we support the end of American democracy. But at the time when January 6th was fresh in their minds, Mitch McConnell was only one of several who said, you know, now he needs to be criminally prosecuted.
When you look at the history of some of these other presidents, do you think that a significant number of them would have had some kind of liability or could have been prosecuted for stuff at a state level?
No, no, I don't. I don't think there are very many cases of pre-presidential crimes that I know about. I mean,
Or
Lyndon
during while in office, right?
uh, I mean, Lyndon Johnson had some sketchy business deals related to the ownership of radio stations. He put in his wife's name, Lady Bird's name, and you know you can read about um, that in Robert Caro's work. And you know, I guess an aggressive prosecutor could have gone after him for that, but except for Nixon's crimes, no. I mean, I've changed my mind on the Ford pardon of Nixon. I've actually changed my mind twice. You know, at first, at the time when I, you know, was not yet, I was starting my senior year in high school, right, right around the time of my Jimmy Hoffa interview. You know, I thought this is terrible that Ford pardoned Nixon. And then by the turn of the century, I was kind of moving to the new conventional wisdom, which was that it was the right thing for Ford to do to heal the country.
Mhm.
And, you know, he received the Profiles in Courage Award from the Kennedy family. And lots of people, I think, including Woodward and Bernstein, thought, you know, it would have just continued to drag the country through this. And Nixon did resign. There was accountability. So it was okay for Ford to pardon him. But I now believe, and I have a lot of company after Trump, that the principle of no person is above the law is so important that in retrospect, Nixon should have been prosecuted for his many crimes.
Uh, One of the, I think you referenced the book First Mothers
Yes,
in one
yeah.
of these, and I was recently reading. There's a few books. I think there's two books on First Mothers. There's a book on First Fathers, and there's a book on presidential parents. And the presidential parents book, his conclusion is that the mother tends to be more influential than the father, and often not. FDR is a great example of that. Obama is a great example of that.
Although there's so many, there are really there are really a lot of examples.
Kennedy's mother was also
Well, I think,
she she said something about how if she would have run for president.
no, I actually think in Kennedy's case, in some ways, he's the exception that proves the rule. His relationship with his father, I think, was more important in that
It yeah, definitely was.
family. But there's just a lot of other examples, and you know, in Carter's case, I'm in my first chapter. is about his relationship with his father, and he could never get his father's approval, and that was very wounding to him. And he wrote poems about it. But if you look at who Jimmy Carter is, well, you could argue that he got his uh, self improvement um, gene and his discipline from his father. He got much more from his mother in terms of the way, his father was a white supremacist. His mother took care of black patients for free, and much of his compassion and his interest in global health and a lot else comes from Ms. Lillian, as she was known, and he wrote a book about her. But he also had this second mother, third parent, an illiterate black woman farmhand named Rachel Clark, who he credits with his love of nature and God. And so it's often a little bit complicated. I mean, in Lincoln's case, Lincoln had a bad relationship with his father, but he had a very good relationship with his stepmother. His mother, Nancy Hanks, died when Lincoln was pretty young, but Sarah Bush Lincoln, his stepmother, he visited shortly before he assumed the presidency, and went way out of his way to go and visit her, which was much harder in those days. And she was a very important influence in his life. And there are a lot of other presidents for whom that's the case. If you look at their upbringing, as you said, it's often the mother. And one of I mentioned, my mentor and editor Charlie Peters, and he said, you know, um, behind every successful man is a mother who thought he was God, and you know, and there are exceptions, and um, um, Gerald Ford, for instance, was an orphan, but he was adopted, but he also didn't get elected president. He came in the back door. Um, but it's a fascinating thing to look at. Many of them had what I would call daddy issues of
Yeah.
one kind or another, where they just had unresolved um, parts of their relationship with their father. And clearly, Obama, who wrote a book called Dreams from My Father, fits into that category. He had daddy issues. Carter had daddy issues. Reagan definitely had daddy issues. His father was a drunk, and his first memoir about his, you know, written before he went into politics, called "Where's the Rest of Me." It opens with his father dead drunk on the porch, and clearly Kennedy did, and I think um, well, we could go through a number of other presidents. We could talk
Yeah.
about Wilson, a number of other presidents, but
I mean, Clinton had this kind of energy that seemed to me kind of similar to Carter after Rickover and after his father died. And this was the footnote we talked about in the last interview, where they kind of entered a new mode. Obama also had that when he went to Colombia and his father died. Um,
so with Clinton, okay, so Clinton's father died before he was born.
before he was born.
He died in a car accident, and Clinton's mother, who fits the pattern, Virginia Kelly, um, was the great influence in his early life. Sometimes not always a positive influence. Like, she would take him to really racy Hot Springs, Arkansas nightclubs when he was like 8 years old. And, she would be in there with all these um, mafia guys who'd come down from Chicago and sketchy people. And so he saw that, but then she'd also take him to church on Sunday. So you had, Saturday night Bill and Sunday morning
Morning.
Bill. and or I wrote a cover story on Clinton once called um, um, Dr. Clinton and Mr. Bill.
That's
uh,
in your book. What's it called? The
I did a
I was
collection of
looking at that. Yeah,
Between the Lines. And while it's really hard to get old Newsweek stories because Newsweek got sold and they screwed it all up, yeah, that book, there are some copies that are still available of Between the Lines that you can buy online. Um, so, and one of the first interviews I did with Clinton, and it came out um, after his presidency. Somebody looked at the logs, and it turned out I did more interviews with him when he was president than any other print journalist. I think some of the anchors did more interviews with him because they were anchors,
yeah,
but
TV.
in print I did the most. But one of them is very memorable for me and is not in the book and is really hard to get, I think, unless you have LexisNexis. Was in early 1992 or maybe late 1991, and I'm pretty sure it was early 92. Yeah. And it was after he had fended off um, the Dodging the Draft and the Jennifer Flowers stories to finish second in the New Hampshire primary and christened himself the comeback kid.
Mhm.
And then he went on to win the nomination. It was in this period, and it was part of a cover story that we did on him. And much of the interview was about how his stepfather, Roger Clinton, was attacking his mother, and he had to step in. And he's
Yeah.
written about this in the years since, but this was either the first or one of the first interviews that I think it was one of the first. I think a couple of people have talked to him about it before. Um, and he described this, standing up to Roger Clinton, his stepfather. And it was obviously a, very important moment in his life. He was a big kid, and he interposed himself between his mother and his stepfather. And I remember him describing to me um, that conflict in his house was it either erupted or it was suppressed, but it was never contained, was the way he described it. So it
Mm.
was abnormal because there was not a sense of kind of moderation in how people in that household got along with each other. They either were in denial or they were about to hit each other or did hit each other.
Do you think this stuff ever affects foreign policy, like Clinton going to Somalia and Black Hawk Down and stuff like that?
Well, there's a whole school of history called psychobiography, and the first early practitioner of it was a woman named Fran Brody, who wrote a biography of Thomas Jefferson that was a psychobiography. There was a psychobiography of Andrew Jackson that used um, his use psychoanalytic techniques to explain his treatment of the Indians and the Trail of Tears. And there was a psychobiography that the great um, um, psychologist Eric Erickson wrote about Martin Luther. And then early in her career, Doris Kearns Goodwin basically wrote a psychobiography of Lyndon Johnson called Lyndon Johnson and the American Dream. And then psychobiography kind of went into decline because it's basically too speculative. And so I think where good historians have come out is you lay out the details of their early life you maybe make a reference to some of their early influences when they are president, but you don't go for cause and effect.
Mhm.
It's not too rigid of an interpretation. So where I used it is my whole in the Carter book is that my whole first chapter about his relationship with his father, a lot of it is very specific about how young, very young Jimmy Carter learned to be a farmer and all of the different parts of farming that he had to master, all of the details, the real details, which I think I made interesting,
Yeah.
of farming. And the reason that I was so specific in doing that is not only because good writing is specific, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, but his attention to detail became a really important part of his presidency, and it was often criticized. Like, and famously, like James Fallows wrote that he even supervised. He got to use the White House tennis court, and it turned out that his secretary was actually, you know, authorized to use his initials to basically forge his initials,
Yeah.
and he wasn't approving. He got to use the tennis court all the time, but he was obsessed with details, and sometimes, especially when he was governor, that was problematic. But I found that in the case of the Camp David Accords that brought peace between Israel and Egypt, the Alaska Lands Bill, which doubled the size of the National Park Service, the Panama Canal treaties, where he became an expert on the history of the Panama Canal, which was very helpful in this very heavy lift to get these treaties approved by 2/3, prevented a war, major war in Central America, in normalizing relations with China, which became the foundation of the global economy. All of these achievements owed something to Jimmy Carter's tremendous attention to detail. And that tremendous attention to detail began on his father's farm. And then later he became an engineer, which is a very detail oriented profession. And so that quality, that characteristic was intensified over the years,
Yeah.
but very important to understanding his presidency. And I think, there are definitely other examples of that. So, the
You
fact,
talked about Obama with that quite a bit. That first meeting with McCain, and he really impressed people with his knowledge. He'd read the 25-page briefs. So I
yeah,
got the sense that Obama was very much like that as well, and that kind
Obama
of
and
legal
Carter,
training.
Obama and Carter have a lot in common. They would rather be home reading a book than schmoozing some congressman,
Mhm.
right? And so yeah, I mean, I think Obama brought other skills that he had mastered in when he was younger, and I think arguably the the most important of them is that when he wrote that book about his father, he resolved a lot of things. He resolved a lot of the insecurities and questions that he had about himself, especially identity questions. Father was black, mother was white. And when he did that as a young adult, he became what I would describe as a fully integrated person, not just racially integrated, but his emotional uh, landscape was
Mhm.
integrated. He became a secure and um, confident person. And the first thing you have to have in the presidency is confidence.
Do you think writing the book was that? Because I wanted to draw a parallel actually between Carter and Obama here. Um, I think the death of the father is one of these interesting parallels, but
Very
another
important.
is like Obama. doing the community organizing work, and then Carter um, going and doing the missionary work. For FDR, he had polio, and that really emotionally changed him.
Yeah,
Um,
hugely important. I deal with that a lot in the defining moment. And also, his mother thought he was God. Sarah Roosevelt, you know, thought he walked on water. And that, I was thinking of titling my FDR book, The Man Who Invented Confidence, because he becomes president and he's able to just take the country out of the fetal position and restore its confidence and basically say, I got up, uh, after I had polio, I, I was able to stand up and walk again, which actually wasn't true because he could only walk with the help of his sons or aides. And, he refused to be photographed in a wheelchair, but spent all of his time in a wheelchair. But that was the impression that he conveyed. I got up and could walk again. So can you. And it was a kind of a conjuring act. And it came out of that immense confidence that he had from the time he was young, that he got from his mother. And that was then deepened into compassion and perseverance, which is also hugely important for these presidents, by the polio experience, which was just absolutely central to his
so
becoming president.
there's actually another parallel between FDR and Obama, which is, and I also want to ask you about Obama reading this book because he mentioned that in a 60 Minutes interview. So FDR had Theodore Roosevelt, and that was a major. I think that was a major um, source of his confidence as well. And then similar, and with Obama, and I've never really heard anybody talk about this, but I kind of um, just came up with it of his father. I was reading Rishi Sunak's biography, and he kind of was a treasury financial policy guy, and that was his path. And I think about the alternative future in um, Obama Senior's path, where his side lost out in the struggle for control of the newly independent government. But if he had been successful, he could have potentially been president.
Right. Or very close to
And I think his mother built that
senior president.
mythology in him, or it seems like that could have been the case. So I was curious if you what you thought about that aspect, like Obama's
No,
mother building up his father as this mythological hero.
she did do that. And she, even though he had treated her terribly and abandoned her and their son, and then, gone to Harvard where he taught for a while, on a fellowship and getting another wife before he'd even divorced Obama's mother. But yes, she always kept him as a kind of a shining example for her son to shoot for, and as an example of a successful black man. And Obama writes about how, they would go to movies and see, Harry Belafonte or Nat King Cole, and she just loved these black men and, really wanted him to feel comfortable as a black man. And that was a very important part of her raising him. I think in the case of um, uh, Franklin Roosevelt, in some ways, the fact that he met Grover Cleveland when he was a young boy, because his father, James Roosevelt, was a friend of Grover Cleveland's, President Cleveland's, and the fact that his, fifth cousin became president when he was in college, yeah, that gave him a sense that, we are an important family, and aspiring to the presidency as he did from a young age was possible. But in other ways, I think Theodore Roosevelt was a source of insecurity, and because um, he was a member of the Porcellian Club at Harvard. This sounds really kind of crazy and ridiculously elitist, but
Kennedy's father also had this, right? He
uh,
wasn't able to get into some of the clubs.
yeah, because he was Catholic. But
Yep.
so FDR himself could not get into the Porcellian, and at the before he had polio, he described it as the biggest disappointment of his life that he didn't get into this stupid,
Yeah.
super um, waspy club. And but
And the Bushes also had the
yeah, they
something
they
thing and
were in Skull
bones,
and Bones.
skull and
Yeah,
bones.
they were in the top club at Yale, which gave them confidence. But the top club at Harvard was Porcellian, and Theodore Roosevelt was in it. James Roosevelt, his father, had gone to Union College, but had been a graduate student or something at Harvard. And I'd never heard of a graduate student getting into Porcellian, but their family was so distinguished that he was in. And then Franklin and a bunch of other relatives were all in. And Franklin didn't get in. And nobody knows for sure why. Some people think it's because he was always uh, going around trying to imitate his cousin, the president, in goofy ways. Like Theodore Roosevelt had something called a pince nez, which was these glasses that rested on your nose, and would just be glasses without any frames or anything. And and Franklin started wearing those, and he'd go around saying "delighted, delighted," like Theodore Roosevelt. And the other kids at Harvard thought this kid's a fool. We're not going to let him in our club. And the other theory, which I actually buy more as to why he didn't get in, is that Franklin had a nephew who was older than he was, even though he was his nephew. And the explanation for this is that Franklin's father had been married before he was married to Sarah Roosevelt, Franklin's mother. And his first wife died during the Civil War. And Franklin wasn't born until 1882, right? So they had a son named James Rosie Roosevelt, who was Franklin's half brother, much older than he was, so much older that Rosie's son, Franklin's nephew, was also older than Franklin, a couple of years older.
Mhm.
And Rosie, the elder, was his half brother, was a terrible anti Semite, terrible snob, just the worst of that breed of aristocrat. And I always thought that part of Roosevelt's success was due to his mother didn't like her stepson and thought he was a ne'er do well. And she wanted Franklin to work, even though he didn't have to, and to not just while away his time, on his yacht and at the racetrack, and should not be biased, bigoted person. And Franklin wasn't. Eleanor was actually more bigoted in the teens. She grew out of it than Franklin was. And so, this guy's son, who was the nephew of Franklin, but a couple of years ahead of him uh, at college, was disgraced when Franklin was there. He took up with a prostitute from the Tenderloin district, and it became a big. They didn't really have tabloids then, but it became this huge scandal in the New York press.
Mhm.
And Franklin, right around that time that he was disgraced by extension by his association with this guy, who had also gone to Harvard, but then dropped out to be with his prostitute. I think he married the prostitute. I mean, it was like night,
Yeah, yeah.
turn of the century scandal piled on turn of the century scandal, and that all happened right at the time he was up for election to the Porcellian. So it sounds like that's a lot of attention that I'm devoting to this, seemingly dumb elitist competition to get into a club, but it was important to FDR at the time, and it also shows you, what a long distance he traveled to being one of our greatest presidents. But I think that confidence, um, was shaken a little bit, and then he got it back some when he ran successfully for the state senate from New York in 1912.
I wanted to also ask you, like, what is it like to have spent so much time around these presidents? Seems like Clinton you've spent a lot of time with, and Obama. What is that like? How does that change your perception of the presidency and of these individuals in a way that other people wouldn't grasp?
Well, I mean, first of all, my relationship with each of them was superficial and professional, and I never confused it with genuine friendship. And it also differed depending on the president. So I've interviewed 9 of the last 10 American presidents, but some of them it was before they were president, like Trump.
Mhm.
Uh, some of them, and George W. Bush. Uh, some of them it was during their presidency, like Clinton and Obama, and some of them it was after their presidency, like Nixon and Ford and Carter. So um, um, the 3 that I got to know the best were Clinton, Obama, and Carter. And I would say that um, Clinton, I've spent the most time, I guess, in terms of hours spent, it would be with Carter, just because I interviewed him so many times for the book. But in terms of kind of connecting, it would be Clinton. And
Mhm.
Clinton has this ability to make you feel like you're the most important person in the world. And he has different relationships with different people depending on what they have in common. So some people he'll just talk to about golf or basketball, and other people he'll have a relationship. Over the years, he's had a relationship with them that's about letting his hair down and being really candid about political things. And my relationship with him was always on a policy wonk level,
Mhm.
where the first time I met him was in 1984 when I was covering the Hart campaign in the primaries, and we landed in Little Rock pretty late. It was a late event. It was like a 9 p.m. event, and at like 10:30, I start talking to the governor of Arkansas in the lobby of the Camelot Hotel, and where he later had a assignation problem. And I we just stood there. We just totally connected. We stood there for an hour and a half or 2 till after midnight. I went up to my room and I called my wife, and she was my girlfriend at that time, and I said, uh, I think I met the next president. This guy was unbelievably compelling. So, but one thing I'm not sure about, like, we were out past midnight. Like, didn't his wife want him to come home? Didn't know anything about Hillary Clinton at that time. And that was the beginning of many conversations I had with him over the years, um, on the campaign trail and in the White House. And then I did the first interview with him after he left office in early 2002. He waited a full year before he gave any interviews. And I did a cover story. The cover line was Citizen Clinton. They had him on the shuttle, the New York to Washington shuttle, as just an average guy, right? And I spent a week with him, mostly at his Harlem office, and Um, I did. I also spent a lot of time with Biden when I profiled him in 2016 for the New York Times Magazine, and I interviewed him a couple of times when he was vice president, and I interviewed him, much earlier as a senator. And Biden and Clinton have that. The reason I mentioned him next is that the two of them are the easiest to, metaphorically have a beer with. Like,
Mhm.
really, in my experience, really get into it, in a deep and pretty meaningful way on important things. And sometimes on policy things where you're drilling down on welfare reform or whatever, and really getting into it. And others of them, it's been, um,
Do you think
sort
there's a class aspect there where Obama has a bit more of an upper class bearing and Carter does as well to an extent?
no, it's not a class thing at all because, I mean, Obama's not really upper class. I mean, he's a meritocrat. He punched all the tickets of the meritocracy. So you could say,
But in terms of his bearing, like how he just, I always
well, he
got
just
that
has
sense,
an elegant and,
elegance.
gracefulness, and um, I've always enjoyed talking to Obama too. I mean, I first met him when he came to my aunt's Shiva. We were sitting Shiva for my aunt in 2001, and my cousin, who, it was at his house, had gotten to know Obama because his wife was very good friends with Michelle Obama. We were all from Chicago. My parents knew Obama. And I remember his cockiness, talk about confidence, and he said that he was going to run for the US Senate in 2004. I guess it was actually early 2002. We had this conversation right after 9/11.
And you were
And
the first to like, maybe
uh,
you can get to that, the first to like kind of recognize him in some way. Forget the detail of it, the cover story or something.
well, yeah, I did the first cover story about him, but in this earlier interview, I was just amazed. It wasn't an interview; we were just chatting,
Yeah.
in my cousin's house, and he had just lost to Bobby Rush, a former Black Panther, for the House, and I had heard that he was looking to run for the U.S. Senate. I said, "Just lost for the House. Are you going to win for the Senate?" He goes, "I'll win. I'll win that. I got it. I got it." You know, and he just had, and I just thought this guy's cocky, and he did. He made good on it, and I
Did
remember.
Clinton have that? Did Biden have that?
Well, I didn't know Biden when he was young,
Younger, yeah.
and he must have because, he was elected to the Senate when he was 29. Think about the chutzpah that it took
Yeah.
for him to run for the Senate from Delaware. So yeah, he was very much like Obama then. And I interviewed both of them about their relationship for a different piece, which is a whole other story. And they had a secret body language code when Obama was president and he was vice president. Um, and they would signal each other, and they, worked this whole thing out. I wrote a Politico piece about this, their secret code. But the in answer to your question, um, I think that uh, it, later, Obama was in ambition mode where he was trying to get elected president and then was president. And then, I've interviewed him, I guess, once since he left office, and, was just much more business-like, because, in the same way that he doesn't like schmoozing with reporters, with politicians, he doesn't like schmoozing with reporters particularly either. And Clinton and Biden are just different. They love schmoozing, I mean, I have a chapter missing the schmooze gene in one of my Obama books, and Carter was also missing the schmooze gene, and it hurt both of them. Not as much as people thought, because Carter got a lot more accomplished, even though he was missing that schmooze gene. But it did hurt them at the margins, and it helped both Clinton and Biden at the margins. I didn't. Um, I actually connected pretty well with Ford also, but I interviewed him at his vacation house in Vale, and I had my wife and kids with me, so that was a little bit of a different session. That was years after he left the president. It was in 2000, I think, and which was also the first year that I interviewed Carter on a Habitat for Humanity site. I later helped Carter build a house in Memphis for Habitat. But um, and in many ways, the most memorable one was Nixon, where that one was in a group. But I arranged in 1988 for Nixon to come to Newsweek because I just always wanted to meet him and interview him. And that was on the eve of the 1988 election, and it was a really really memorable conversation that we had with him. It was all
What was it usually like? Like, did you just get an hour with them and
so
you were working on an
this
article or
really
something?
varies. This varies, a lot. So, for instance, with Carter, if I interviewed him in Plains at his house in Plains, I'd be there for like 3 hours, 2.5 hours.
Mhm.
And but if I interviewed him at his office in Atlanta, it was exactly 1 hour because he was on a schedule, very disciplined. He had other people coming in. And so his secretary would come in after exactly 60 minutes.
Yeah, I wanted to
With
ask you about that, like especially with your time with Quentin, like when you're spending several days, are these guys generally on a presidential like do they kind of um organize their life and their office and everything kind of and their calendars and stuff? Do they kind of keep that presidential routine?
very much so, very, very much so. Yeah, they're very, very scheduled and busy. And so, for that story, Citizen Clinton, where some of it was I was breaking news by, like, asking him about Mark Rich for the first time and that kind of thing. That was in a formal a formal interview that was probably, I don't remember exactly, but probably about an hour. And but then, I would talk to him in the car, and I did the same thing with Carter and Biden. You're talking to them when they're going to their next appointment. If they're going to, make an appearance, you talk to them a little bit in the green room, so you have snatches of conversation with them as they go about their daily business. And then you have a more formal interview. And sometimes, in the side conversations, they'll go off the record or whatever. And, you'll not be able to necessarily use it, but it
Yeah.
will help inform you. And then sometimes they don't really go off the record and they say something pretty interesting. But it just would vary. But yes, in answer to the question, they all have schedules, and even Carter's vacations are like this. Not that he can take them anymore, but his grandchildren would tell me about how, they'd see things, like at the end of the schedule, they'd see, RON, which, if you're traveling with the president, stands for rest of night. And, and that would be, they'd be at the hotel and they get like a printed out schedule of all the things they were going to do, when they go on these big Carter vacations, whether it was
Was there like a briefing book for these things, stuff like that?
almost like, for these kids, for the grandchildren, children and grandchildren and their spouses. Yeah, they almost felt like they were on a presidential trip, but they really varied a lot in terms of their timeliness. So Clinton was always on Clinton time, which meant that if you were talking to him and you thought you were going to talk to him for 20 minutes, you were still there like, you know, 70 minutes later, you know. Uh, Carter was at the other extreme. And, you know, he would sometimes, the bus for the family would leave people behind. The only one he would wait for was Rosalind. And then he was a little bit annoyed about it. So I actually saw that when I interviewed them on their 70th wedding anniversary at Annapolis. And I wrote a little, I was doing double duty interviewing them for the book, and I wrote a little New Yorker Talk of the Town piece about it. And he was
Oh,
like, even though he had given her as a present, you might remember this from the book, 1 year as a like birthday present or anniversary present, he was, you know, was a woodworker, and he made a plaque that said, "This entitles you to be late. You're the only person who can be late, and you know, I won't yell at you anymore for being late."
there was something on the campaign trail I remember from the Carter book where he just left everybody behind and was like, "You guys need to figure out how
Oh
to
yeah,
get there."
yeah, he would do that. Well, he would. So he would sometimes, because he's, you know, very cheap, and at the time they didn't have any money for the campaign, and you know, he'd be traveling around Iowa as a former governor with just Jody Powell. And actually, this was in the gubernatorial campaign where this happened. But
Yeah.
he would, you know, get up, and if Jody Powell wasn't up, he would leave, and he'd make Jody Powell hitchhike to the next event to catch up with him. He's like, "I'm not. If you're not ready, when I'm ready to leave, I'm leaving. I'm leaving when I plan to leave."
I want to ask you another parallel question that I haven't seen anybody really look at, which is um, presidents whose fathers were salesmen. And this was the case with Clinton's stepfather and also with Obama's maternal grandfather.
Yeah,
And I was wondering if you thought anything of that.
I've never thought of that before. It's an interesting insight. I'd be cautious about cause and effect, but it's true that any good politician has to be able to sell. And I think um, James Earl Carter's success in business, and he would sell anything. You know, he and his, you know, determination to sell and to make use of everything definitely rubbed off on Jimmy. And I don't know to the extent that it did from Roger Clinton. Um, uh, and sometimes these guys would have other influences. And as far as Obama's grandfather, I don't think that, you know, my memory of what he's written about that and said about in interviews, I don't think that him as a salesman really had a big impact. I think the fact that his grandmother made it all the way up in the bank to a fairly senior position, even though she didn't have a college degree, I think that really impressed him. And you may recall that just days before he was elected president in 2008, like less than a week
Yep.
before the election, he flies out all the way to Hawaii to see his grandmother on her deathbed. And because he knows that if he waits, he might not see her. And he regretted that he hadn't gone to see his mother on her deathbed when she was dying of cancer. But his grandmother was a really important figure in his life. And I think her fortitude, persistence, I think more than sales, because, you know, sales is complicated, and, you know, the lessons you can learn from, you know, your father or grandfather, if he's a salesman, it's hard to,
I think the storytelling, like his grandfather was
yes,
always telling stories in the family, and
I would say storytelling would be more important than sales.
yeah.
And if you read what Obama has written, he's a huge believer in the power of narrative and really good at writing narrative. So when you mentioned that I did Obama early, so in late 2004, Obama was a senator elect, and Newsweek was trying to compete with Time, which had Person of the Year, originally Man of the Year.
Well,
And we had this thing at that time, this is before Newsweek was run into the ground, called Who's Next? And the editors, top editors said, well, let's make it Obama. And Alter knows Obama, and so let's send him down to do the interview. So that was when I first read Dreams from My Father, which had been published several years before. And
Thing
uh,
96.
yeah, when he was a nobody. And it was just then being republished. And I read it, and I remember saying to him in the interview, uh, this isn't fair. You're too good of a writer. Like you choose, right? Politics or writing, because his storytelling in that book, his narrative skills were so good. And so Obama has always seen himself as a storyteller and always believed in the power of that. And so I would say that that would be where his grandfather would be more influential. But Michelle Obama always said, I think Barack was raised by wolves. She sort of thought of him as a kind of emerging, having raised himself. And when you read Dreams from My Father, or David Remnick's book, which is about his early life, pre-presidential life, you do get this sense of somebody who raised himself. And if you read David Marinus's book, First in His Class, you get that sense about Clinton also, that he essentially raised himself. And that's very empowering if you do that, and so with Biden, he talks about his father all the time on the campaign trail. But I think in many ways, even though family is so central to him, I think in many ways he was pushing himself at a certain point too. And and after he'd not done very well in college and law school and had been kind of a slacker, and where he got that intense ambition is always a big question for me. Where does that motor come from? Does it come from your father? Maybe your father's thwarted ambitions, and that's what Biden
Kennedy.
talks about all the time. His father's thwarted ambitions. The hardest thing he had to do was come and tell his kids, "I lost my job." And so where drive comes from, where that's a very important psychological thing to have, psychological dimension to have in a book. And
What do you think with your, like, you seem to have repeatedly made good predictions. And to me, that's one of the
I've made
best
Tim, I've made
signs. Yeah.
I've made so many bad predictions. I
Yeah.
don't think, just to interrupt you, I don't think it's a good way of judging pundits, because you know we remember the accurate ones, and we don't remember the ones we got wrong. And it's better, I think, to judge us by how we interpret context, and the past, and the issues that we've been talking about, like uh, what what's going on inside these guys. Where do they get it from? Where And the most brilliant book ever written about that, which is especially relevant, are the Biden chapters, was What It Takes by the late Richard Ben Kramer, which I would recommend to all of your viewers and listeners, because that's a book about the 1988 candidates, except Al Gore, who wouldn't take part. But it's Dick Gephardt, Michael Dukakis, who became the nominee, and most memorably, Joe Biden and Bob Dole. George W. Bush is also in there. So, his sections, I feel like that's kind of third, that part of the book is third to Dole and Biden. But you really get a sense of what happened with the accident and how that shaped Biden, where his wife and daughter were killed, and what that did to him. And sometimes there are these events, or what the war did to Bob Dole. He came back and spent months in the hospital from his injuries, and how that shaped him. So, we've been talking about parents, but a lot of time it's also these experiences like polio. But you still come back to this question of, where does that motor come from? Where does that drive come from? And
Do you
where
do
does
you
that grievance come from? And that grievance that was Nixon nurtured these grievances, and there are a lot of clues in his history. Evan Thomas wrote a really good book about him. John Farrell wrote a good book about him, and they get at these grievances, and obviously these grievances drive Trump. And someday, and there have been already been some good books written about him. I think Mary Trump got at a lot of these psychological dimensions in her book about her uncle, but other historians will come along and get at that. Where did that ugliness come from? Where did
you did
that?
a good interview with Maggie Haberman?
Oh, I'm glad you saw
Yeah, I
that.
watched that.
Yeah. uh,
Um,
yeah, so she, hers is sort of more first draft. Like when you're writing them in real time, it's harder. It's really harder. And we don't know how the Trump story ends. And so, but historians will have a very interesting time with all of that. Although I don't think he's very complicated. And heard something interesting recently, that I had not read in any of these books, from somebody who knew his mother in Queens. And she said that his mother felt she couldn't control him and he was a brat, which is the way his sister, the judge, Trump's sister, became a judge in New Jersey. And she, on the record in some interview, described him as a brat when he was a brat when he was a kid. And arguably, he's still a brat. He
he was
has
sent to military school because of that,
right.
for high
He's sent to
school.
military school because of that. Yeah, and that just super self-centered, completely unempathetic, um, brat.
He
Um,
also kind of wanted to live up to his father or supersede his father, kind of like Carter did.
yeah, yeah, and interestingly, I don't think Kennedy was bedeviled by that at all. I don't think he, wanted to, you know, um, outdo his father. It was more his father was grooming him, to replace his older brother and be president, like, which is what he wanted first for himself, because Joe Kennedy thought of running in 1940, and then for Joe Jr., and then for Jack. But I think Kennedy was actually pretty secure, like Obama. And Ben Bradley told me once that Obama reminded him of Kennedy so much, and he knew Kennedy really well. He wrote this book, Conversations with Kennedy. He was basically Kennedy's best friend, and he really thought rightly that Obama and Kennedy had a lot in common temperamentally. We're talking here, Tim, about temperament, and the great
Yeah.
political historian, political scientist and historian Richard Neustadt, one of the greatest political scientists of the 20th century, who I was lucky enough to take a class from at the when I was an undergraduate. I took a class from him at the Kennedy School of Government, and
And
he had
he's a
been
great scholar of the presidency
great.
at like a academic level.
Yeah, but he writes well, so it's not academic prose. So his book. Uh, well, he was head of Kennedy's transition, and he basically believed that temperament is the great separator, and that's how you distinguish between in any realm, whether it's president or corporation, leader of a corporation, that the ones who succeed have the right temperament. And there's that famous um, line from Oliver Wendell Holmes um, on Holmes's 90th birthday. He just retired from the Supreme Court in, um, I think it was, it was in the second week of March, 1933, because it was a week after Roosevelt became president. And they had a party at Holmes's house in Georgetown for the justice's 90th birthday. And the new president came over to pay his respects. And they drank a little bootleg champagne, which, would be today like, Biden going over and smoking dope with, Justice Breyer or something. And when Roosevelt left, Holmes famously said of him, second class intellect, first class temperament. And Jeffrey C. Ward wrote a great book about the pre-presidential uh, Franklin Roosevelt called First Class Temperament. And I have that story in my book, The
Yep.
Defining Moment, as well. But so that just goes to this point that temperament is so important. And I think temperament relates in part to some of it's inborn, but some of it relates to your sense of security. And so you have these really insecure presidents like Nixon and Johnson. And then you have these much more secure presidents like Kennedy and,
I didn't get the feeling that Johnson was super insecure. That's
oh
interesting.
my God, he was so insecure. He was so insecure and such a tangle of
Because he
insecure.
really looked down on Kennedy. He thought Kennedy was a lightweight.
Well, that's because Kennedy looked down on him and treated him like crap when he was vice president. And
But like
um,
before
yeah, but
that period.
that's because Johnson was, as Robert Caro called him, master of the Senate.
I
So by
mean,
that
the
time,
two of them to me almost seem like Biden and Obama to an extent, where Biden had a lot more experience in the Senate. Obama came in as much younger, pretty inexperienced.
yeah, I mean that's in part why both of them were selected. But uh, there's a difference between one's ability to wield power and one's um, ability to manipulate people and one's insecurity. Sometimes you can be very insecure. I actually think that Trump deep down is hugely insecure. Why else would he brag all the time and say he's the greatest, this and the greatest? Only insecure people do that, right? And Johnson's insecurities manifested themselves in getting into Vietnam. Like he was insecure about on on some level about his manhood and had to prove his manhood by going in, even though part of him was telling him, "Don't do this." Whereas Kennedy, I mean, historians will never resolve whether Kennedy would have gotten us out of Vietnam. My opinion, which is not, can never be fully validated, is that he would not have. And if you look at the last interview that he did in September of 1963, he did interviews with Walter Cronkite and David Brinkley because the evening news was expanding from 15 minutes to half an hour. Think about our 24-hour news cycle now and 24 hours a day of cable news. At that time, there was 15 minutes of network news, and there was no cable. But in both those interviews, he indicates, and I have some of this in my senior thesis about Vietnam, that I think at one point he says it's their war to win or lose. You know, within a year and a half, Johnson had 500,000 troops there. Why did he do that? Because on some level he was insecure, and a lot of it was about proving who was had as Trump said in the one of the debates in 2016, mine is plenty big, right? And a
Well, he
lot
had
of
the
the
thing with Kim
presidents,
Jong Un with
right,
the button.
right. And by the way, this could work on a number of different presidents. So when they were coming in and trying to convince uh, Reagan to sign off on the MX missile, and which Carter had just viewed as a bargaining chip, and or some other missiles, they came in with the missiles that looked like penises, and they had the Russian Soviet missiles were longer, you know, and than ours. And that was their audio visual aid to say, we need bigger missiles. But all of these things are, you talk about it at a psychological level.
I
If
just
you
think it's
read,
hard to like the president. People want a strong president, and they want that bravado to like. I think where it's difficult is like you said with Obama, his cockiness or like his confidence. Like you can always make an argument that that's coming from insecurity, or it's coming from that people want that show of
no,
strength in a leader.
I don't think Obama was insecure. No, I
But
think
how
he
do you
was,
explain the
I think he
cockiness
was
if
just
it's not
cocky.
out
But
of
cockiness is
insecurity?
not, no, but cockiness is not what Trump does. There's a difference between being cocky and having confidence in yourself and being a shameless braggart and,
So what's the
lying about
difference?
yourself and saying, I mean, the last thing, I mean, Obama is so much uh, Trump's opposite, as is Carter. That was why, one day I'm at the Carter Library and I, get called by MSNBC, go to the Atlanta bureau and, you know, oh, Trump's coming down the escalator, right? And he comes down and he says Mexicans are rapists. And, I remember my relief at going back to Jimmy Carter, who didn't lie, and for the next 4 years, anytime I was disgusted with Trump, I could always go back to Carter, who was the un-Trump. But Obama was also the un-Trump. And that's one of the reasons Trump got elected, because American voters often go from one extreme to the other. So they go from old Eisenhower to young Kennedy. They go from old Bush World War II generation to baby boomer Clinton. And
What do you think about the sex appeal of presidents
but
with
I want
Kennedy
to
and
just make sure we
yeah,
clarify this point.
go.
There's a difference between being cocky, which is just having that confidence, like FDR had and Obama, Kennedy, and being like a guy who is saying like I'm better president than Lincoln.
Mm-hmm.
That comes from insecurity. Cockiness doesn't come from insecurity. It's just for a lot of different reasons. You have what it takes to be president. You basically have to have that immense self-confidence. You have to be a little bit, off. Although I actually think Obama was the most normal person of the presidents that I met. I think he was pretty much of a normal guy in a lot of and but sorry, you wanted to talk about
Yeah, like the sex appeal of Kennedy, of Obama, of a younger president, um, Teddy Roosevelt to an extent with his masculinity thing and
yeah,
him kind of reinventing himself.
that could
What do
be
you think about that?
hugely important, hugely important. You can read Norman Mailer's Superman Goes to the Supermarket about JFK, and hugely the, the sexual thing was big with Clinton,
Yeah, Clinton.
Obama, Kennedy. Um, I even think that George W. gave off a certain kind of virility that contrasted well with Gore.
He had kind of a, there was an interesting thing by George Lakoff's wife. I'm blanking on
Yeah,
her name, but she wrote the thing about Bush Jr. and his kind of becoming more masculine for the presidency.
Yeah, I mean, some of that is artifice, like George H.W., like he wanted to seem like he wasn't. Newsweek had a cover story once that enraged him, um, and this it's the opening of Roger Simon's book. Is he's sitting in a dark room, really angry because Newsweek has just put him on the cover in his boat, and the cover line is "Fighting the Wimp Factor." So this was when he
This is
was
senior 41.
senior,
Okay.
very at the time very famous cover of Newsweek, and he was portrayed when he was vice president. George Will called him a lapdog Republican columnist. Well, he's not a Republican anymore. He quit the party after Trump, but that tinny lapdog. And so Bush went around like telling everybody that he really loved country music and that he liked to eat pork rinds. And that was him trying to seem more like a Texan than an effete Connecticut guy, which is really more of who he really
Yeah.
was. George W. Bush was born in Texas, and so he didn't have to pretend to be a Texan. So he had that whole Texas macho thing going much more easily than his father did. And it
And
hurt his father.
him and Kennedy, there's an interesting similarity where Jeb was kind of initially seen as the one who was going to follow in his father's footsteps, and
Yeah, well,
George.
that's good. I had never thought of that. I'd never thought of that, but it had always been, Jeb who was going to do that. And then he lost for governor in 94 and George W. won for governor.
And he got married pretty young, and to I forget the whole story, but she didn't speak English or something.
Yeah,
Like
he
there was
married
kind
a
of a
Mexican woman. He's still married to her. And she got into trouble on a smuggling thing some years ago. But yeah, Jeb got married very young, and Jeb,
almost sabotage, self sabotage
yeah,
potentially.
and Jeff. Well, no, I don't
No,
think so.
okay.
No, I don't think that hurt him politically at all. In fact, it helped him in Florida, I think. But Jeb was the intelligent one. George H.W. Bush is a very intelligent guy, and I shouldn't say very intelligent because he doesn't have the IQ of Carter, Clinton, or Obama, but he does have he did have a high IQ, and he was very very well versed, especially in foreign policy, and very well prepared for the presidency. Maybe the most prepared of anybody, with the possible exception of Biden, just because he was in government for so long and was also vice president. But the difference was that Joe Jr. was killed in World War II, and Jeb just lost an election. And also JFK, next in line, was not really a ne'er do well, and George W. He had these confrontations with his father when he got drunk, and when he said, "Oh, let's go mano a mano," when he's drunk, and he didn't turn it around for himself until he was 40, and that was a long time for his father to worry about him. Meanwhile, Jeb is doing a lot of impressive stuff before he's 40. So, and it was natural, even though George W.'s older than Jeb. It's another difference from the Kennedys is that
Well,
George
you know,
W.
I mean, with
Was
a lot of the presidents, also their marriages themselves have been part of their. They've been these sort of ambitious marriages that, if not directed directly towards becoming president, they chose wives that would be useful. FDR, obviously, that was a piece of marrying Eleanor. Um,
well, I don't know. I mean, I think that
he
one,
was more connected to Teddy. I mean, she was.
Well, she was
Wasn't that
his
in the book or?
she was his favorite niece, and it's true that marrying her brought him. I mean, the president, the incumbent president Theodore Roosevelt, gave her away on St. Patrick's Day, 1905.
Yeah.
So yes, was that a motivation to get closer to the president on FDR's part? Yes. Um, um, but I'm not, that was sort of a, yeah, I think, yeah, you're right that would, he had to have that somewhere in his head. Although I think he also, even though, he famously cheated on her in 1918, and fell in love with the love of his life, Lucy Mercer. I don't think it's fair to say, because Eleanor was ugly, she actually wasn't as ugly as her pictures, and she was attractive enough at the turn of the century. It is possible that he loved her when they got married, and I think people are a little cavalier and just assuming that he didn't because she was not especially attractive. The there are these other partnerships where it's very clear that the husband would never have become president if not for the support of the wife. So Jimmy Carter never would have become president without Rosalind. Although at the time they got together, there was no thought of that at all. I mean, theirs was a true love match, and they've been married for 77 years.
Although
Uh,
wasn't the story she wasn't that into him until he had the uniform on and
well, they didn't. So she was best friends with Jimmy's younger sister, Ruth, and Jimmy just didn't pay them any attention. It's not that she wasn't into him, it's just she was a kid. They had met when she was 3 days old, and Jimmy's mother, a nurse, had delivered Rosalind and brought her toddler, 2.5-year-old, around to see the new baby. But they didn't really have anything to do with each other because they were not in the same class in school. And, she was just like his sister's friend, and he didn't really
yeah,
pay much mind. And then when he went to the Naval Academy, and there was a picture of him in uniform in the Carter house, Rosalind, when she was visiting her friend Ruth, would sort of moon over that. And after her father died, she spent more time in the Carter home. Although when they got married, Ruth was so jealous. She felt betrayed by both her brother and her best friend because she knew that they were now best friends, which was very upsetting for her. And she went on to be a New Age evangelist who baptized Larry Flint on a pink yacht, and lots of
several books, interesting
lots
books.
of lots of Ruth Carter Stapleton stories. But
What about
Roosevelt,
Michelle Obama? Do you think she's going to run for president?
no, no, she hasn't. She hates politics. And this is one of those things where like everybody's a pundit now, right? So like those of us who actually spent time doing this, I was laughing about this. I won't tell you who it was. Another like pundit, like I'm sometimes described like we were just laughing about this because like because there's 24/7 to fill on cable, like ideas like this get kicked around because Republicans like to say it. But I would put the chances of Michelle Obama running for president between 0 and 0. So
Well, like
um,
Clinton married a lawyer, Obama married a lawyer.
so in Clinton's case, Hillary, before they were married, was his campaign manager. And he knew as early as Yale Law School when they met that she would be an enormous help to his political career. And he was already cheating on her, actually.
How so? How did he know that?
How did he know that she would be? Because
Yeah.
she was like the smartest person he'd ever met. And he was just bowled over by her when they met, by her
Wow.
intellect. And they had a kind of a, they describe it as a conversation that's gone on um, for 50 years.
And
And
she wrote her thesis on
even
Alinsky.
yeah, 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 that's right. She wrote a thesis on Solinsky, but they were working together on campaigns like Joe Duffy's campaign for in Connecticut, and so they, from the first time they met, and then when he is running for the House in 1974, and he loses just out of law school, basically, he loses to John Paul Hammerschmidt, and at one point the campaign is not going well, and he calls Hillary to come in and try to rescue the campaign, which she kind of does. She straightens everything out. What she doesn't know is that Clinton is having a fling with somebody else on the campaign at the time when Hillary's supposed to be his girlfriend. But that just goes to what happened later on, and but I think that there's no way that Clinton would have been president, and he described them as two for the price of one when he was elected. So Rosalind Carter was Jimmy Carter's most important advisor, and Hillary Clinton was Bill Clinton's most important advisor.
What do you think Hillary
Not
would have
exactly
done if
what?
she had won in 2016? What do you think she would have done? Like, what were her top three things have been?
That's a really interesting question. So my daughter is interviewing her on stage on May 22nd at the Chicago Humanities Festival for the Joanne Alter lecture,
Oh, cool.
which is named after my late mother. My daughter, Charlotte Alter, is a senior correspondent for Time magazine. And that's actually a really good question for her to ask Hillary Clinton. What would your three most important initiatives have been? I think she would have actually returned to childcare, which was one of the things that got her into politics. I mean, long before she was in elective politics, when she was first lady of Arkansas, and she had worked for Marion Wright Edelman on children's issues. She'd written a lot about children's issues. She was known as one of the most important child advocates as a member of the bar
Mm-hmm.
uh, in the 70s and 80s. And so I think she would have tried to do something like what unfortunately just got discontinued, the child tax credit,
Tax credit.
which cut poverty in half in the period, child poverty in half in the period when it existed, and now they wouldn't extend it, to the great disappointment of people like Senator Michael Bennet, who understand how important it is, and the great disappointment of anybody who follows these issues, anybody who cares about poverty. And so I think that she would have done that, tried to do that. I don't know whether she would have had the votes in the Congress to get that done. She would have, I think she would have wound down the war, continued to wind down the war. She had voted for the Iraq war, but I think her experience as Secretary of State, and I traveled with her around the world for Vanity Fair when she was Secretary of State in 2014, I think it was.
I want to ask you a brief tangent on, and the Iraq War is a good example. This is just kind of the fog of the presidency of decision making, where, especially in foreign policy, you don't always know, you're not always certain what's going to happen or what the facts on the ground are. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, this is what makes being president such a hard job, is what they call the fog of war. And the only decisions that come to you are the really, really hard decisions.
With
And
FDR and Obama, the economy and like having a theory of economics and like what's gonna, like with FDR, without World War II, it seemed like you were making the case that it's not clear some of his stuff would have worked, or how much of would it worked, like, half measures.
It wasn't working that well. There was another recession in 1937, and it was before the war, but it wasn't until our arms industry started providing weapons for that we eventually sent to Great Britain after the beginning of World War II in 1939. But it was a couple of years before we got into World War II, but our economy was starting to recover, and then it really went like gangbusters during the war. But I think some conservatives say, well, then obviously the New Deal failed. That's not true at all. I mean, he cut unemployment in half, and he restored the confidence of the American people, and so and he put a lot of people to work, created millions of jobs, and it's it's wrong to say that the New Deal failed economically. It's true that he did not have a growth agenda, because of his antagonism toward Wall Street. He didn't really think enough about wealth creation and where wealth creation comes from. But that's different than saying the New Deal failed,
Right.
and but it is just a matter of historical fact that we didn't fully recover until World War II.
Carter, that was also an issue with Carter, where it was like, well, did he cause things to improve, and then Reagan got the credit?
Well,
um
he did. I mean, in one very important way. First of all, the bad economy was not Carter's fault. So he was defeated in a landslide for reelection, in part because of double digit inflation, double digit interest rates, which mostly came out of uh, Middle Eastern politics, the Arab oil embargo, OPEC, and then later after the Iranian Revolution, all of the Iranian production went offline, but you could argue that the high interest rates were Carter's fault, and the story behind them being Carter's fault also tells you why he should get the bulk of the credit for the recovery that Reagan got the credit for. Remember, Morning in America, that's how he
mhm.
got elected in 1984. And the reason for that is that in 1979, it was Jimmy Carter who appointed Paul Volcker as chairman of the Fed. And anybody who understands economics understands that the chairman of the Fed, or now we've had women
Chairwoman
chairwoman,
Janet Yellen.
yeah, Janet Yellen, the chair of the Fed has much more power over the economy than the president.
Mhm.
It's not even close.
Trump
And
was constantly complaining about his chairman.
he was complaining about Jay Powell because, Jay Powell was not going to do his bidding and goose the economy right before the election the way Arthur Burns did for Johnson in 64 and Nixon in 72. So, the and Volcker wouldn't help out Carter, and he told him, and it's to Carter's great credit, Carter appointed him anyway. It almost went to another guy, the president of Bank of America, whose wife didn't want to move to Washington. And if that guy, who was much more pliable, if he had become the chair of the Fed, history could have been very different. But what Volcker did was he said the only way we're going to end this inflation, which is just killing us, is to jack up interest rates, which he
Yeah.
did. Really, really bitter medicine. And it led to the very steep recession of 1982, where Reagan was so much less popular than Jimmy Carter had ever been. Well, actually, no, Carter went down into the high 20s, but he was much more unpopular in the second year of his presidency than Carter was in the second year of his presidency because of this really bad recession. But it was short. And by the time it ended, we had growth without inflation, which we then had all the way until COVID. So which has made everything possible. And that was because of Jimmy Carter's appointee. Now, people will criticize Paul Volcker for all kinds of things, for his heartlessness, throwing all those people out of work. And you're going to find some economists who say, well, they could have done something about inflation without, throwing the
Yeah.
economy into recession. I don't think so. That's not my interpretation. Now, at this point, they don't actually. I don't think Jay Powell has to actually create a recession to tamp down inflation. He's already shown that you can tamp down inflation without a recession, which is arguably the most important news of 2023, is that our economy is doing well with lower inflation. And so but
It was kind of self-sacrificial, or one of the other parallels with Obama, his first hundred, his president-elect period, and FDR is FDR kind of played hardball with Hoover, didn't wanted to kind of let things get worse, whereas Obama was like, we need to do something now. We're not going to wait for it to get worse and worse. We're not going to let things blow up.
yeah, because the economy in late 2008, fourth quarter of 2008, was even worse than it was in 1930, which was the depths of the Great Depression. It's hard to believe, but in terms of the shrinking of the economy, unemployment wasn't as bad because at the depths of the depression, it went to 25%. And I think the worst,
Just the absolute poverty was much higher back
and the
then.
absolute poverty was much higher in the depression. But in terms of the shrinking of the economy, which is really scary, if you're about to become president.
Mm-hmm.
So Obama spent some political capital on getting the second tranche of the TARP bank rescue approved. And this was very unpopular. So even though he stayed pretty popular his whole first year, and my first Obama book, The Promise, is about his first year as president. Um, and It was the Roosevelt book that he said on 60 Minutes that he was reading because
Did you ever ask him why he read it or what he got out of it?
no, I thought that was sort of too self-centered a question to ask him. I mean, I'd like to ask Biden that because Biden uh, has been photographed three times, once during the campaign and twice in the Oval Office, with the defining moment, my Roosevelt book,
Wow.
on his little bookcase on his desk in his office.
Wow.
And you have to like blow up the picture, which of course only I do, you know, to see it. But he said on a podcast, on Brene Brown's popular podcast, at the end of the campaign in 2020, that he was reading my book, and he said things that indicated that he actually read it. And so,
So
in
it's
both,
almost like an instruction manual for Democratic
well,
presidents.
I think that these guys, if they're coming in difficult economic times, or actually in Biden's case, what he got out of it was how fragile democracy was in 1933, which is a big part of my Roosevelt book, that a lot of people wanted autocracy.
You uncovered a special
They,
document, right, on the dictator thing.
yes, and Roosevelt himself was tempted to seize quasi dictatorial powers. And there was a car called the Dictator that was made by Studebaker and popular, and newspapers ran editorials, wanted a dictator.
Mussolini was
We
very
were having a
popular.
moment kind of like we are now, where this question of democracy was really on the table.
What do
And
you think the status of democracy is right now? Like, how how do you measure that? How do you measure?
I,
Um,
I,
yeah.
well, I think 2022 was a very encouraging election,
Yep.
especially because the secretaries of state candidates who were anti-democracy lost, and the voters were able to recognize that these guys were only going to certify elections where Republicans won, and that would make it quite possible that the 2024 election was thrown into the House of Representatives, because they just, like, if you know these guys won in Arizona, this, and Nevada and a couple of other places, they just never would have certified the results if Trump didn't win. And then our democracy would end. That would be it. It would be lights out. Right. And so we dodged that bullet in 2022. But what concerns, and that's not going to be a threat in 2024. So, the winner of the election will be the winner in 2024, which is a big few for democracy.
Mm-hmm.
But we have one of our political parties, which has now become, at in many places at the state and local level, and clearly at the national level, an anti small d Democratic Party, an authoritarian political party.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Donald Trump has said that he would suspend the Constitution if he's reelected president. And yet he's the front runner. And a lot of gutless, cowardly Republicans are saying that they would put party over country, party over democracy, their own, coattails over our democracy, by saying they would support him if he was the Republican nominee. And any Republican who says that should be shunned for the rest of their political life by voters, because they are indicating that they do not believe in our system. They don't believe in it. They're at heart authoritarian.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, they would not risk an authoritarian, potentially despotic, American president. And believe me, Trump knows a lot more now about the levers of power, and he's indicated it, that he would make the FBI into his private agency.
Mm-hmm.
He's said it all. It's, I don't like these Hitler comparisons, but and I'm not saying, Trump is going to put everybody in a concentration camp, but he, like Mein Kampf, he said what he would do if he gets reelected. And what he would do is end democracy. So anybody who backs him, or even if they say critical things about him now, if they would back him if he's the nominee, they're also for risking the end of democracy. And, in terms of these trials, like, okay, there are weak, charges arguably in Manhattan, but in these other cases, in Georgia, and, if Jack Smith brings January 6th charges, these are about the rule of law in our country, whether might makes right, or we have a functioning constitutional system. Because remember, they're celebrating the January 6th insurrectionists. The MAGA Republicans are not saying, oh, forget about that episode. Those people were just some crazy followers. No,
Mm-hmm.
these are the heroes now. These insurrectionists who were trying to overthrow the government, and so is democracy still at risk? Absolutely. And it's very concerning, even though
I get the sense that state by state issues are heating up, where states are ignoring pieces of federal law, or there's that kind of dynamic. Do you have any thoughts on that?
well, all of those things, have the effect of weakening democracy. The Constitution is very clear that federal law supersedes state law.
Or these extradition things, like we're not going to extradite people
Yeah,
for
I
this
mean
or that.
that is, I mean, when DeSantis said that. I mean, it turned out that Trump voluntarily went back to New York. But when DeSantis said that, you know, that was frightening. DeSantis, no, he's a smart guy. He knows
He was a lawyer in the
that
military,
is,
prosecutor.
and he went to Harvard Law School. That is not a little bit unconstitutional, not arguably unconstitutional, but explicitly 100% unconstitutional. And any Supreme Court would make that clear. So the idea, let's say DeSantis had done that and said, I'm not allowing Trump to be extradited from Florida to New York. And that would immediately go to court. And I have complete confidence that by 9-0, including Clarence Thomas, DeSantis would have been slapped down on that.
I mean, with
Because
Eisenhower,
what they
he had to
call,
send in the National Guard. So that's where these things go, right?
well, uh, I mean, if he had literally not done that, but I'm just talking about in court, like, there's this thing called black letter law, which is like unambiguous law, like law that lawyers can't even argue about because it's just right there. And so that's what this is that, you know, you you don't have to do that. That's why we got rid of that when we got rid of the Articles of Confederation. When we became one country, you didn't have to extradite anybody. We're living in the same country, you know. So but that's an example of these bonds to our Constitution getting stressed by MAGA Republicans. And DeSantis he's apparently going to run against Trump, but he's basically a MAGA Republican. That's
How
his
much do you
game.
compare Trump with? I just thought of the Andrew Jackson quote of John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it.
Yeah.
Andrew Jackson is kind of the most similar to Trump in some
Yeah. I don't think
ways.
it's any coincidence that Trump put a painting of Andrew Jackson in the Oval Office when he became president. It's not a coincidence. I mean, Trump doesn't know anything about Andrew Jackson because he doesn't read, but somebody told him that Andrew Jackson was his kind of tough guy. And they might not have told him about that particular comment, but they told him that, that's what Jackson was like. And so
It just seems to me that the fissures start with these issues of who's going to enforce a Supreme Court decision. That's
yeah.
the real weakness of the Supreme Court, and
Yeah.
that's
And
where the
then, I
federal
mean, and
troops
then you
had
had,
National
and
Guard had
then,
to be sent in.
right. And then at a certain point, in the 19th century, the National Guard becomes the Union Army. Like,
Yeah.
you eventually this thing turns into civil war. And in the 19th century, I don't think that's going to happen in the United States, in part because there aren't these regional things, and so it would, but the system could, um, if if Trump wins, it's the end of our 230-year experience. It just is, and it's over. It's over. And I'm not normally given to um,
Hyperbole.
hyperbole. I mean, it can be reversed.
What do you think he would do? Like, what's the?
It can be reversed. Like, you can have a counter revolution, and we've had many countries in particularly in Latin America, but also in Asia, that have gone from authoritarianism to democracy. So
But what would he do? Like,
we
how,
could
how
go
do you think
back to
he would
democracy, but if
implement
he's
this?
president, how would he implement?
What mechanisms would he?
He would, well, I mean, he's using his,
There were fears during COVID that he might go authoritarian, and there was an emergency powers
right.
pathway.
He didn't know how to do it. But see, now there are all these theories, and DeSantis could do this too, about basically using a loophole in the Civil Service Act to turn large numbers of people into political appointments. And he would totally politicize the FBI because he always does what he accuses others of doing. So it's all projection with Trump. Like when he's saying, oh, the FBI is being politicized, what he means is, I want to politicize it for me.
Hmm.
That's like the way he rolls on everything, right? So he would politicize the FBI, and he would um, basically just like try to govern by executive order, which is something that he talks about all the time, and that he didn't issue enough executive orders, and he would find any excuse he could to implement, uh, you know, uh, some kind of power grab. I mean, he's said all this basically. It's not going to be, it's going to be retribution. I mean, retribution is not a small d democratic
It's
idea.
it's sort of a lawfare idea of using the courts and investigative powers.
Well, I don't think he's going to be able to use the courts to do that because I don't like the direction of the Supreme Court personally, but I think that, you know, the courts are what saved us in 2020 because he lost all 60 cases that he brought. And I think actively defying court orders is hard in the same way that, he did voluntarily go back, to be arraigned when he was indicted. So he realizes you can't really defy court orders. But what we found is that so much of American government is not about laws, it's about norms and traditions. And so he burst somewhat through the guardrails in in when he was president, but now he just like go full power through the guardrail and like run right over the median strip. Like, there won't be any impediments on him. Or, you remember how he like used to appoint people like Jim Mattis.
Hmm.
There's not going to be any more of that. Not going to be any more appointing people who are not his personal agents. And they can do a lot. When you have the presidency, you have a lot of power, even if you can't get any bills through, even if things that go to court don't go your way. There's just a lot of things you can do too. And he has these role models in people like Viktor Orban, who were
Yeah,
elected.
this is kind of
Vladimir,
a worldwide
Vladimir Putin,
movement.
who he admires. It's the only person he's never said anything critical about. Only one, not a critical word. He admires him. He'll look to what he did. And a lot of times it doesn't happen all at once. But there's a whole literature, you can read Timothy Snyder, other people, on how democracies die. And Trump now knows how to kill a democracy. It takes a little bit of experience to learn how to do that. But we know he doesn't believe in it. And if you don't believe in it, you're not going to do anything to defend it.
I wanted to,
And I
yeah.
mean, we'll see. He's going to take some grief from this. Chris Christie, is saying, how can you swear to take an oath to defend the Constitution when you've said explicitly that you want to suspend the Constitution? And, I mean, so he's gonna have to get past all that to get elected, which I don't think is likely. I don't even think I think it's unlikely, but things can happen. You could have, Joe Biden could fall ill, and then suddenly it's a campaign between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, and he got
There,
71 million votes the last time, so he can get back in, but I do think people need to be reminded of the stakes and
mhm.
reminded of what a departure it is from all of these presidents, including Nixon. All of these
Um,
presidents, it's a departure from them.
uh, I wanted to ask you if there's any leaders out besides studying the U.S. presidency, the prime ministers, English monarchy, anything like. Have you studied any other world leaders in depth, and are there any parallels that you think are, or biographies that you think are particularly interesting for people
Uh,
interested in the
well,
presidency?
people, parliamentary systems, you don't have to have, quote, what it takes, as in Richard Ben Kramer's description in quite the same way. So you don't need that same level of confidence. You don't need to necessarily have had this upbringing that gave you this big engine. Um, so you can have a greater variety, I think, of leaders and their backgrounds. But just to get back to something I was talking about
Yeah.
before, I think it's it's the autocrats that we should be studying, and because we just have one party right now that has a weakness for them.
Mm-hmm.
CPAC, Conservative Political Action Committee, originally, the big conservative organization, um, run by Matt Schlapp, who now as a Republican and was taking him to court for having attempted to molest him. Uh, um, he held CPAC's meeting in Budapest. Think about that for a second. And
What does that mean?
this is a party. I mean, they want to take instruction from Viktor Orban on how you turn a democracy into an autocracy, which is what's going on in Hungary. How you scapegoat people, the way he scapegoated Soros, that's now become contagious. It's now become de rigueur in Republican politics, even though that it has more than a whiff of anti-Semitism to it, which we can talk about if you want. And
I
and
think it connects to the lawfare thesis of like trying to this move towards trying to influence the various tentacles of the legal
yeah, you appoint
system.
different judges. You use kind of state controlled media, which we now basically have. We have one of our cable,
Prosecutorial discretion.
right? And it's done slowly, and often, and it's called sometimes illiberal democracy. So it
Okay.
might be still a democracy in form, might be technically a democracy. You might technically have elections the way they still do in Russia.
Russia.
You know, Hitler came to power through an election. People forget that, right? So it's not all like a coup d'etat, or it lawfare is a good way of describing it.
Putin's opponent's been charged with various
Well, now Putin
stuff.
now Putin is becoming a despot. I mean, it's a different now he's in a different phase of the life cycle of the authoritarian, and he's clamping down, and basically, Putin is now a full on dictator. The word dictator, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, didn't really apply to Vladimir Putin. He was an authoritarian leader. Now he's an
But
actual
he was
dictator.
playing games with having that other guy come in as president to
Medvedev.
get around the.
Yeah. He was, I mean, and that was an example of, illiberal democracy, but still a democracy where you have to obey the term limit thing, but you get your puppet to take over for a little while. And
That was part of FDR's thing was to. Wasn't there a thing where he was going to have two people resign and then he would come in as.
oh, yeah. So FDR sometimes had harebrained schemes. They wouldn't last very long, but yeah, he had this idea to have, uh I think he wanted, like, he thought things were so bad under Hoover, like, well, so that I can
Oh,
be
we could come in early. Yeah.
come in early, and the way to do that is for Hoover to appoint me Secretary of State, and then he resigns, and his vice president resigns, and I become president in November of 1932 instead of March of 1933.
I mean, the House of
That was
Cards
just like
TV show
that
is
wasn't a
almost like
serious that wasn't
that.
a serious proposal by Roosevelt. But Roosevelt was he passed up a chance to be a dictator in 1933, as I mentioned. But when he decided to run for a third term, which had never been done before, there were a lot of critics who called him a dictator. Like, this is a dictator move. We have a norm in this country of only serving 2 terms. Thank God he won a third term. Though actually Wendell Willkie would have been a pretty decent president, and he might have been a good president in World War II also. But we would have been deprived of Roosevelt's great wartime leadership if he hadn't done that. But yeah, so there have been other presidents who have violated norms. Certainly Nixon did, and we haven't talked much about Nixon, but he violated not just the law but all kinds of norms.
Didn't he have a lot of suspicion of the FBI also?
Yeah, yeah, he did, and
How do you compare that with Trump's
well,
things with the FBI?
so basically, Nixon was nearly impeached. He would have been impeached if he hadn't resigned, which is why he resigned. The
And
smoking gun,
convicted. He would have been convicted.
yeah, convicted. Well, he would first he had to be impeached because they had voted impeachment in the House Judiciary Committee, but it hadn't gone to the floor of the House for an impeachment vote at the time that he resigned in August of 1974. But he uh, and Nixon on the smoking gun tape, the June 21st, 1972 tape. Basically, the smoking gun is him telling uh, his aides to use national security to get the CIA to force the FBI to stop its investigation of the Watergate break-in. And so, yes, but that was, Hoover had just died, J. Edgar Hoover, and he ran a very independent FBI. So there were efforts to try to rein him in that failed, and he thought that Nixon was going too far.
Did Kennedy also distrust Hoover?
Oh yeah, I mean,
So,
it's Kennedy was so Hoover's the way Hoover rolled, and I wrote a Washington Monthly article about this that when I was quite young in 1981 or 82. On the cover, it had Hoover face to face with a bulldog. You see the bulldog and Hoover in profile. And Hoover basically blackmailed a series of American presidents because he
also
had
blackmailed Martin Luther King, tried to.
tried to blackmail Martin Luther King, but he tried to blackmail Kennedy because he found out that Kennedy was having an affair with a woman named Judith Campbell Exner, who became very well known when all this came out in the 70s. But at that time, in the early 1960s, she was having an affair with both the President of the United States and Sam Giancana, who was wrongly described as the head of the Chicago outfit, the mafia in Chicago. He's actually number two to Tony Big Tuna Accardo, but he was a very powerful mobster. And clearly, this would have blown Kennedy sky high if it had ever come out.
And his
Um,
father was connected to the mafia in various allegations and stuff.
yeah, and they say that Sam Giancana was connected to the Kennedy assassination. There's all kinds of
Yeah.
theories about all this stuff, and some of which is true and a lot of which is untrue.
But big picture, the whole lawfare idea and the FBI being politicized. I think you were going to make a point on that.
Yeah. Um, yeah. I mean, you know, people in the FBI can push back. I actually think it was politicized, and we're going to find out more about this in the New York office of the FBI in 2016 on behalf of Trump. And Giuliani has hinted at this, that, one of the reasons that Comey did something that was totally improper when he was head of the FBI and came forward and said that Hillary Clinton was being investigated
Mm-hmm.
for these security breaches that now, look, like nothing. I mean, the entire Trump family started using private emails the minute they got to the White House, exactly what they had used to beat Hillary. But
Mm-hmm.
Comey does tremendous damage to Hillary. I'm not saying what she did was right, it wasn't good, but by saying that she has acted irresponsibly, although not necessarily illegally, very, very damaging. And there are indications that he did that because he thought that the pro-Trump elements in the FBI office in New York would have leaked that if he didn't do it. So they were forcing his hand
Interesting.
in 2016. So, there've been elements of the FBI. And of course, the Republicans think that the Democrats, politicized the FBI to use it against Trump. And they shout about this on Fox all the time. But if you actually take a really close look at it, it doesn't seem to be true, which is what happens in a lot of these cases with charges that are,
Yeah.
whether it's Russia hoax, there wasn't a Russian hoax. And, what the way Barr politicized the FBI by, the way they handled the Mueller report, is just one example of that. But that's a whole other,
Yeah.
and I have
Huge
to
thing.
actually join my wife.
Yeah. I wanted to ask just a quick kind of bullet answers to wrap things up.
Okay.
Like, what are your favorite biographies of uh, the last 5 or 10 presidents, or just the big presidents that are rated the highest? What's like the best biography, especially like Lincoln, where there's hundreds of biographies? Could you just kind of give us the
Yeah.
either
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
authors or the
Yes.
books that you think are the
So,
best for each of them?
yes. So, my favorite biography of Lincoln, you will not be surprised to hear, is written by the college professor who I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation. His name is David Herbert Donald, Donald. It's a one-volume history of Lincoln. It's just called Lincoln, and it's the best. There are many other good books written about Lincoln, some of them by my friend Harold Holzer, but that the David Donald one to me is the best. Theodore Roosevelt. Um, there were, I think, um, that, um, well, I like Mornings on Horseback a lot. Uh, but that's by David McCullough. That's his about his pre-presidential life. I actually don't have a one volume Theodore Roosevelt.
Yeah, I
Uh,
don't think whether it's one volume or not
well, no,
makes
it's
any
important
difference.
that it be well.
Oh, okay.
Okay, if it's just any book about
Yeah.
them,
Yeah.
uh, then yeah, I think Mornings on Horseback. Uh, um, Woodrow Wilson, the best one volume, the best book about him is, um, um, I'm just having a moment here. I'll remember the author's name. Um, he also he wrote a biography of the publisher Maxwell Perkins. So if you just
I
put
can
it,
email you, and I can put the
yeah,
list in the description.
yeah, yeah.
What about more modern?
So then,
Eisenhower, for example.
Franklin Roosevelt. There are many good books. Um, uh, you know, um, I mentioned Jeffrey C. Ward, Doris Kearns Goodwin, She wrote a book called No Ordinary Time about the Roosevelts during the war. I think for Roosevelt as president before the war, obviously, I'm going to, recommend The Defining Moment. Uh, um, Harry Truman, I would say David McCullough, one volume, fantastic book, just called Truman.
Mhm.
I don't have a favorite book about Eisenhower. Um, Kennedy, there's a new book about Kennedy, the first of two volumes. I'm sure the second volume will be good. It's not out yet. By a Harvard historian named Frederick Logevelle, Logevelle, um, that I would strongly recommend.
Mhm.
Uh, John Farrell also has written well, and uh, LBJ, Robert Caro is has basically mopped the field.
Mhm.
Uh, and Nixon, I would recommend Evan Thomas's one volume biography of Nixon. Um, there really isn't one on Ford, although Richard Reeves wrote a book, contemporary book about Ford called A Ford, Not a Lincoln.
Mhm.
Uh, I really recommend the work of Richard Reeves on several of the presidents. What he would do is he would take a really close look on what the president's daily life was like. You were asking about that.
Yeah, yeah, I'm interested in
So
that.
those I'd recommend. He did one President Kennedy, and he did President Nixon, I think, on uh, Carter. Obviously, that one I'm not going to cede the field to anybody, in part because mine was the first biography of him.
Yeah.
Um, um, for Reagan, I'm not sure there's a really great one volume or any biography of him that I would recommend beyond one called Reagan by Lou Cannon that was written when he was still president, and I would recommend Lou
Mhm.
Cannon, Cannon. It's a very good book. Um, let's see. So since then, um, you know,
The Bushes.
John Meacham, I would recommend John Meacham on Andrew Jackson. He won the Pulitzer Prize for that book. And then he wrote, um, the best biography of George H.W. Bush. Uh, and, um, the um, best book about Clinton is by David Marinus. It's called First in His Class. And then that's about the pre-presidential Clinton. And then a guy named John Harris wrote uh, a good book about Clinton. And I think about Clinton's presidency. And I think George Stephanopoulos' book about Clinton is worth reading. Um, uh, then George W. Bush. I don't think there hasn't been a good biography of him. That's well, actually, there was one that came out recently, but I haven't read it. Uh, and I think did Gene Edward Smith write one about George W. Bush? He just
Not
died,
sure.
but Gene Edward Smith is really good, and he wrote one on Roosevelt also and other presidents. And I hear that his book on George W. Bush is really good. You need to check that he wrote one because I haven't
He
read it.
did. It's called Bush, written in 2017. 447 ratings on Amazon.
Yeah, I would recommend that book, even though I haven't read it, because just based on the reputation of the author.
832 pages.
And then, I wrote these two books about Obama. It's pretty early, but this book that was written by David Remnick called The Bridge is a really good book about Obama, and that's about, if you want to know about Obama's really interesting life before he became president. That's an outstanding book by the editor of the New Yorker, David Remnick. And then there are many Trump books, and I don't read most of them.
Mhm.
So Trump awaits his biographer.
Cool. All right. Well, I really appreciate you spending the time and a lot of stuff I learned today. So, is there any place you'd like to, people can check you out on Twitter? I'll put a link to that,
Well,
your
no, I mean,
Substack,
what I want them to check me out on is at Old Goats, my
Old Goats. Yeah.
Substack newsletter, and I would love it if people subscribed. Obviously, I prefer you buy a paid subscription, but you can also get it for free.
Do they get anything if they do the paid one?
Not really, because I just I just ask people to kind of voluntarily support me, but I don't want to
Mhm.
deprive people who don't want to pay of what I post on the site. So for right now, anyway, I'm one of the rare Substack newsletters where you get as much for free, and so I'm not. Um, I just want more readers. I think in part, Tim, when I worked for Newsweek, wrote a column, we had um, 3.5 million paid subscribers and 20 million total readers with the
Wow.
pass rate. And now, of course, Newsweek's a tiny fraction of that. And my Substack newsletter is an even tinier fraction.
I'm curious, like, why did you go independent? Why didn't you could have probably gotten a job almost anywhere?
Yeah, it's because I do all these other things with my life. Like I'm a documentary filmmaker, and I have television entertainment projects. I was executive producer of a show called Alpha House. It's available on Amazon. That's about four Republican senators who live in a man cave together. It's a comedy that I produced with Gary Trudeau, the cartoonist who um, did the writing of the episodes, but I was very involved in the plotting of the episodes, and that was really fun. And so trying to, I've got some entertainment projects that are floating around, and also, I do write for other publications. I wrote a piece for the New York Times recently. I've got one about Carter that's pending, but I don't, at this stage in my life, I don't like to have to answer to anybody. So it's just, I kind of like the self-publishing. I just wish that I could go from thousands of readers to tens of thousands. I'd be happy with tens of thousands. I don't need hundreds of thousands, which nobody has on Substack.
Mhm.
I just need a few more to make me encourage me to continue to do this.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks a lot
But
for coming.
just to
Yeah.
very quickly, Tim, just to give people,
Yeah. Go
I
ahead.
sometimes write a column, but then I interview really interesting people who are over 60, which is why I call it Old Goats. And there's a lot of, some of what we've talked about has been in some of these Old Goats interviews, but
Mhm.
there's a lot of them. I interviewed Gary Hart. We mentioned him. I interviewed Ralph Nader. I asked him some hard questions that are on the Substack site about the 2000 election. Some of them are non-political. I interviewed a magazine editor who had been editor of Rolling Stone, Sports Illustrated, and Esquire, named Terry McDonell. I interviewed him last week. So I don't care whether they're famous, and it's not like TV interviews where you have to go, oh, if they're not famous, nobody will watch.
Right.
I just talk to people I'm interested in, who I think have interesting stories to tell. And then other weeks I write a column, you know. So that's basically what Old Goats is. And I hope people
Actually, there is one other question. So, if you were the first Jewish president, what would your top three things be?
That's a wow. Nobody has asked me that. That I really like that question. Um, I think my first priority would actually be what Biden's is. And even though I don't think Biden should run again, I wrote a long New York Times article about that recently. Um, I agree with him that defending democracy is priority one. I think doing even more on climate change would be number two. And number three would be um, really putting a lot of chips on um, children, and non-bureaucratic ways of helping kids out of poverty. And that's why it was so disappointing that the child tax credit was allowed to expire. And, it was a very clean uh, um, way of dramatically reducing poverty. And when you do that, you get all sorts of other good effects that come out of that. And it actually, even though it costs a lot at the front end, it increases the productivity of the country if children are not raised in poverty, dramatically increases it. And so it's not just an investment in children, it's an investment in the future of the United States. So I'd say democracy, climate, children would be
Anything about China? Just
well, that's a relationship to be managed. And so that's not an agenda. But yes, staying out of war with China, that would be high on my list. Making sure that we don't have a big war. Yeah, I mean, keeping the peace is, I'll put that above the three I mentioned. That's extraordinarily
do you
important.
overall support this kind of onshoring stuff or
Yeah,
the chips and all that?
yeah. No, I think that's an important part of investing in the future of the United States. And yes, it's very important to restoring the middle class. And
So,
yes,
one other quick
I
question.
approve. I
Yeah.
approve of. I approve of almost all of the Biden agenda, but he's falling down a little on the execution, like
Mhm.
on at the border. They obviously need to do a better job, and I don't think he's done a good job on affordable housing. So I can critique certain parts of the Biden program, but generally, I'm a strong
In
supporter.
agreement. And in terms of what kind of campaign you would have run, like what kind of president would you say is most similar to how you would campaign?
I think there's a few of them, who you could learn a lot from. You can learn a lot from Carter's 76 campaign about retail politics. You can learn a lot about Clinton, about focusing on the right issues and developing the right message from Clinton's 1992 campaign. And you can learn a lot from Obama's extraordinarily well run campaign in 2008, about how to organize and execute and inspire.
Mhm. All right. Well, I appreciate you going through all my questions and
Yeah,
learned a lot.
it's super
So,
fun talking to you, Tim. You ask great
thank you.
questions. Unlike most people who interview me, you actually do your homework in a serious way. And it's always fun to talk to you and look forward to talking again.
Are there any books on just interviewing that you like?
Not really. Not really. I mean, I think you can, if you watch different interviews, different people's interview techniques,
Mhm.
you can pick up a lot. So if you have access to LexisNexis, you might want to look at this cover story I wrote about Ted Koppel, who was my ideal of interviewer in the 80s and 90s. And he was the anchor of Nightline. He works for CBS Sunday Morning still. He's, still at it. But he, I think, was the best interviewer I ever saw.
When was that? When did you do that cover story roughly?
Would have been in maybe in the early 90s. No, late 80s. Really hard to find online, but you can. And the cover line was just Q&A, Ted Koppel's Secrets of Interviewing. And he said that the most important quality of a good interview was listening, because you don't want to stick to your questions all the time. You want to
Right.
listen to what the subject of the interview says, and then think of another question based on you listening. Most interviewers are thinking about their next question, and they're actually not listening very closely to what the person is saying. I shouldn't say most. Some interviewers don't do as well as they could because they don't listen.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And then the other thing is you got to pull the trigger. You got to ask the question you're a little afraid to ask, not worry about whether the guy's going to be offended, or the woman.
Yeah.
That
Agreed.
doesn't that doesn't mean you ask stupid, offensive questions. But I asked Bill Clinton when he was president after the Lewinsky impeachment. It was the first time I interviewed him after that. We're in a presidential limo outside Hartford, Connecticut, and I asked him, "Mr. President, are you going to seek psychiatric treatment for this?" Clearly had a problem. A problem. This was enormously self-destructive behavior that he was engaging in. Why are you self-destructive? You got to ask that.
Did you always say Mr. President?
Not oh no, I didn't call him Bill, but if I was using an honorific, yeah, it would be Mr. President. Although when they're no longer president, like Carter preferred President Carter, not he didn't think he should be called Mr. President because he wasn't president anymore. Eisenhower preferred to be called General. He
Mm-hmm.
thought that was his highest title after he left the presidency. Um, but yeah, I think that you have to pull the trigger. He didn't like it. He blew up at me, but
What did he do?
I can't believe you asked me that question, John. I cannot believe you asked me that question. And then I said, well, you said recently you were having pastoral counseling. So, well, why don't you ask that? I said, okay, Mr. President, how's your pastoral counseling going? You know,
What did he say?
and then he got out. He was so mad that he got out of the limo
Uh,
without saying goodbye,
wow.
left in there alone for several seconds until the Secret Service agent finally came around and opened this, 2 foot wide door,
Yeah.
armored door, let me out of the beast, as they call the limo. That was a really memorable interview, which ran in Newsweek.
Well, you're a legit guy. You're a legit journalist, and I've really enjoyed all your books. His Very Best, The Defining Moment, The Promise, and The Center Holds. So, Jonathan Alter, thanks a lot, and
Thanks so much, Tim.
really
Good to
appreciate it.
see you.
Okay, thank you. Bye bye.